Greetings, today I'm going to talk a little bit about the combat rules. And I'm going to start with morale. Morale is not found in all role-playing games because players like to have complete control of their characters, and they keep control of the characters here even if they become afraid. But they will suffer a -2 to their offensive value and to their defensive value, but not to their missile defense value, because you're not going to be easier to hit if you are afraid. Anyhow, morale is tested for each group, typically for the player party and the encounter group, at the start of any encounter or sighting. Sorry. And again, for a side if one of their members is killed. Morale tests are group tests, meaning only one die is rolled for each side. However, adjustments to the die roll and the results of the morale test are applied individually, so the least courageous individuals on each side are most likely to become afraid. If a new creature with a higher fright mod joins the fight later on, or if the odds change, the same die result as for the initial morale test will be used, but with the new adjustment. That means that some characters may become afraid when this happens, and others, if for example the odds improve, may no longer be afraid. And I'm going to talk a little bit before I continue here how this works, because NPCs, if they become afraid, that is, if they fail their willpower test, they become afraid and they will try to retreat to a safer location, where they can continue fighting. But for example, if you have a group that becomes afraid and they retreat to some of their comrades elsewhere, and this changes the odds, then they might actually no longer be afraid, and they will join their comrades and attack their foes anyhow. And on a critical failure, NPCs will flee. For player characters, it doesn't really matter if you fail or critically fail, other than if you critically fail, your character will be afraid longer until he has rested. But he's never forced to retreat, flee or surrender. So the PCs can decide for themselves how to react if their characters become afraid. A character can also provoke a morale test for humanoid creatures once during an encounter by attempting to intimidate them. To succeed, the character attempts to intimidate needs to score at least a critical success on a strength test, because they want to look strong and dangerous. If two normal morale tests, that would be not spell provoked, because you can provoke a morale test by spells too. If two normal morale tests result in at least a semi-success, characters who are not already afraid will remain fearless for the rest of the encounter. So you won't have to test morale over and over and over again. If your characters or the foes succeeded twice, they will actually not become afraid in that encounter. Then you also have characters immune to fear, such as trolls, that would be undead, and Attins and some animals too, are unaffected by morale tests. If all creatures on one side are immune to fear, there is no need to test morale at all. And morale for creatures is based on size, with some exceptions. As you can tell, the dwarf, halfling and nymph have better morale than their size would otherwise suggest. You have different adjustments depending on whether or not you are outnumbered or if you outnumber the enemies, and these will apply to that one group test. I may add that if animals become afraid, they will try to flee, but if humanoids become afraid, they will not immediately try to flee, but try to retreat to a safer location instead. So fear is treated a little bit different depending on the type of creature, whether it's a humanoid or an animal or someone who is unaffected completely. And here is an interesting consequence of being afraid. It's a condition. You get a penalty to your die, that is, you get an adjustment to the die by +2 because you are afraid. And funnily enough, if you are afraid, you get a +5 movement rate per round adjustment. So if you are chased by some creature and you want to evade it, it might actually be an advantage to be afraid, because you will be a lot more desperate when you try to get away. Being afraid in combat means that you suffer a -2 adjustment. And note here that in combat, the point is to roll high, so a minus is actually a bad thing in combat. Whilst for skills, a minus would be a good thing, so take note of that. Yeah, you suffer a -2 to your offensive value in melee and missile, and also to your defensive value when you are fighting. But of course, you won't be easier to hit with a missile weapon if you're afraid, so that doesn't matter. And the ability score willpower is what determines the character's morale. But note that halflings enjoy a -4 adjustment because of bravery, innate bravery. Also in relation to resisting magic, by the way. So halflings are incredibly brave, and this is of course also suggested by the individual Tolkien who invented them. And related to morale, you cannot win a battle without first facing it. And yes, some spells will improve morale. Some spells will improve morale for entire groups. Other spells will force morale tests on enemies. And of course you also find magic items that can help you scare your enemies, like blowing a horn or wearing an Ægir helmet. Things like that.